Hello, welcome to BEH 229 Family Counseling. Today's presentation will be on the origins and growth of family therapy. So, to look at where family therapy came from, you have to go all the way back to the end of World War II, which was in 1945. Researchers and then practitioners first turned their attention to the family's role in creating and maintaining psychological disturbance, and this was due in large part to two significant social experiences. One, you had a lot of soldiers coming home from the war. They've seen some horrible stuff. They experienced some horrible stuff, and then they just come home and have to reacclimate into society. Secondly, the women who had been at home before the war had to take jobs during the war to support the war effort, and they experienced the first level of independence that women really had experienced in a long time. So there was a lot of strife in families after the war. So this sudden reuniting of families created numerous problems, social, interpersonal, cultural, and situational, for which the public sought solutions from mental health specialists. Accustomed to working with individuals, these professionals were now expected to work effectively with an array of problems within the family. In general, psychotherapy became more accessible to people from a broader range of social and educational backgrounds than had been the case before the war. So, in addition to the gradual acceptance of systems theory by many clinicians, four other seemingly independent scientific and clinical developments during the decade following World War II helped set the stage for the emergence of family therapy. Number one, the investigation of the family's role in the development of schizophrenia in one of its members. Number two, the evolution of the fields of marital and premarital counseling. Number three, the growth of the child guidance movement. And number four, advances in group dynamics and group therapy. So we're going to start off with the aspect related to schizophrenia. Initially, the family environment was investigated to see if family dynamics might account for different forms of adult psychopathology. In particular, researchers consider the role that a pathogenic family environment plays in the development of schizophrenia. So at this time, they didn't understand that there was a biological link. They thought that there was a social issue that caused schizophrenia. Maternal rejection was postulated by Frieda from Reichmann for the development of male schizophrenia. And again, schizophrenia is more prevalent in males than females. In a widely quoted paper at the time, this prominent psychoanalyst, known for her work with schizophrenics, introduced the term schizophrenic mother to denote a domineering, cold, rejecting, possessive, guilt-inducing person who, in combination with a passive, detached, and ineffectual father, causes her male offspring to feel confused and inadequate and ultimately to become schizophrenic. A linear cause and effect relationship between the pathogenic families and schizophrenia. These initial efforts to link schizophrenia to family life were ultimately rejected, because researchers today search for biologic and genetic markers trying to understand the disorder's origins. And we know there are certain brain issues that are related to schizophrenia. So it's not just a situation where the family creates a schizophrenic. Nevertheless, the concept of the schizophrenic mother remains historically important in the evolution of family therapy because it directed attention to dysfunctional interactions within a family context and shared by all family members. In 1952, Bateson, then affiliated with the Palo Alto Veterans Administration Hospital, received a Rockefeller Foundation grant to study communication patterns and paradoxes. What ultimately proved most intriguing to this group was the manner and frequency with which schizophrenics set conflicting and contradictory feedback messages at the same time. In 1954, with a 2-year grant from the Macy Foundation to study schizophrenic communication patterns further. So he got his first grant from the Rockefeller Foundation, then the Macy Foundation. And they were interested in developing an interactional theory around the sequence of exchanges between family members. The research group began to study the possible link between pathological communication patterns within a family and the emergence and maintenance of schizophrenic behavior in a family member. The researchers hypothesized that the family, when upset and threatened, seeks a homeostatic state through feedback mechanisms that monitor the family's behavior in an effort to achieve balance and stability. They speculated that the appearance of schizophrenic symptoms in a family member interrupted parental conflict when it occurred, and instead united the adversaries in their parental concerns for their child concerning returning the system to its former level of equilibrium. Eager to publish their preliminary results, Bateson, Jackson, Haley, and Weakland issued a landmark paper in 1956 introducing the double-bind concept to account for the development of schizophrenia in a family member. The paper described a patient's interaction with his mother. A young man who had fairly well recovered from an acute schizophrenic episode was visited in the hospital by his mother. He was glad to see her and impulsively put his arm around her shoulders, whereupon she stiffened. He withdrew his arms and she asked, "Don't you love me anymore?" He then blushed and she said, "Dear, you must not get so easily embarrassed and afraid of your feelings." Note the sequence of the mother's underlying message. Don't touch me, go away. Don't trust your feelings in regard to how I respond, i.e. come closer. Don't challenge the contradictions in my behavior. You can't survive without my love. You're wrong and at fault no matter how you interpret my messages. So he hugs her, she stiffens, he pulls himself back because he feels like she's rejecting him. Then she says, "But I love you, don't you love me anymore?" So it's that inconsistent emotions that don't match her actions. The authors report that the distressed patient promptly became violent and combative when he returned to the ward. When a person is confronted by expressions of love and hate, with an invitation to approach and an injunction to stay away issued by the same important figure, Bateson's group hypothesized that he or she is forced into an impossible situation of trying to discriminate correctly between the contradictory messages. These researchers hypothesize that once the pattern is established, only a hint of the original sequence is enough to set off a panic or rage reaction, and for schizophrenics may lead to a gradual withdrawal from the world of relationships. Although double-bind communications later proved not to be the cause of schizophrenia, the historical importance of this landmark research is its focus on schizophrenia as a prototype of the consequences of failure in a family's communication system. Further research made it clear that double binding occurs at one time or another in most families, without such serious pathological consequences as schizophrenia. Schizophrenia is now seen as a debilitating brain disorder, one in which communication difficulties and reduced social functioning between family members are often present. And this little cartoon on the right-hand side, we never forget that you have a choice. And the one door says damned if you do, and the other door says damned if you don't. So that's really the idea of a double bind. Moving on, at the same time, Theodore Litz at Johns Hopkins University and later at Yale began publishing his findings of the family's role in schizophrenic development of one or more of its children. A psychiatrist trained in psychoanalysis, Litz nevertheless rejected the notion advanced by Fromm Reichmann and others that adult schizophrenics were suffering from maternal rejection. Particularly, he refuted the idea of a rejecting mother by calling attention to the father's possible destructive role, describing 5 patterns of pathological fathering of schizophrenics: rigid and domineering, hostile, paranoid, of little or no consequence at home, or passive and submissive. So these 5 patterns were also evidenced with schizophrenic children. To these researchers, carrying out longitudinal studies of families with hospitalized schizophrenic members, schizophrenia was a deficiency disease resulting from the failure of both parents to play supportive and complementary roles with one another. Litz and his associates described 2 patterns of chronic marital discord that are particularly characteristic of schizophrenics, although they may exist in normal families to a lesser extent. Now again, remember, we now know that schizophrenia is more of a genetic or a biological issue. It's not necessarily a family issue, although a traumatizing family can actually bring schizophrenia on. It can actually, if someone is prone to schizophrenia, it can encourage its development. Same thing as when young people smoke a lot of marijuana, that will affect someone who has schizophrenia in their genetic makeup and potentially bring it to the forefront much faster than if the young person had not been smoking a vast quantity of marijuana. So marital schism refers to a disharmonious situation in which each parent is preoccupied with his or her own problems and fails to create a satisfactory role in the family that is compatible with and reciprocal to the spouse's role. Each parent undermines the worth of the other, especially to the children, and they seem to compete for loyalty, affection, sympathy, and support of the child. Threats of separation or divorce are common. It is usual in such families for the father to become ostracized, a non-entity, if he remains in the home. In marital skew, which the researchers also observed in families with schizophrenic offspring, the marriage is not threatened, but mutually destructive patterns nonetheless exist. The serious psychological disturbances of one's parents, such as psychosis, usually dominates this type of home. Litz and Associates concluded that male schizophrenics usually come from skewed families in which there is a dominant, emotionally disturbed mother, resistant to the needs of other family members, but nevertheless intrusive in her child's life. At the same time, a skewed family usually has a father who can neither counter the mother's child-rearing practices nor provide an adequate male role model. Murray Bowen, a psychiatrist, broke new ground in the study of schizophrenia. In a dramatic experiment at the National Institute of Mental Health, Bowen arranged for mothers to move into cottages on clinic grounds near their hospitalized schizophrenic children for several months. He was interested in identifying unresolved symbiotic mother-child interactions. As he later reported, families of schizophrenics often demonstrate the interaction patterns resembling Litz's findings about marital schism. Bowen termed the striking emotional distance between parents in such situation emotional divorce. He described the relationships of this kind as vacillating between periods of over-closeness and over distance. Eventually, the relationship becomes fixed at a point of sufficient emotional distance to avoid anxiety. They settle for peace at any price. Then, during adolescence, when the child usually strives for a measure of autonomy, the situation becomes especially stormy and stressful. And this is typically the time when schizophrenic behavior begins to appear. Bowen proposed the notion that schizophrenia is a process that spans at least 3 generations before it manifests in the behavior of a family member. He suggested that one or both parents of a schizophrenic are troubled, immature individuals who, having experienced serious emotional conflict with their own parents, are now subjecting their offspring to similar conflict situations. The couple's child, who in turn is even more vulnerable to dysfunction, passes the deficit on to the next generation, and so on, finally leading to a schizophrenic individual. So basically what Bowen is saying is that, in his opinion, and again remember this is 50 years ago, in his opinion schizophrenia was an environmentally developed psychosis or mental disorder that is carried down through the socialization in families, not necessarily the genetics. And of course now we know that the genetics play a much larger role than they knew 50 or 60 years ago. So let's fast forward a little bit, because we should also examine what the women were saying, because women were being blamed. So, through analyzing this history, Seaman examined the shift in the understanding of a schizophrenia and the family from a feminist perspective. She suggests that the work of Bateson, Litz, Flex, Corneliuson, Wynne, while offering new insight, maintained a then prevailing view of the mother as a damaging cause of illness. Seaman concludes that in our current judgment, parents of schizophrenic children are co-victims of the illness who suffer along with their children because of the burden for caring for them. So what Seaman is saying is, no, mom didn't cause this issue. Mom is dealing with this issue in the same way that the schizophrenic is. And this is that separating socialization and behavior from the genetic anomaly that creates schizophrenia. Next, we're going to talk about the American Ortho-Psychiatric Association Convention in 1957. All studies described thus far were cross-sectional in design, involving families in which schizophrenia had been diagnosed in a member, usually a young adult, often long before the research was carried out. The major barriers to testing such assumptions is that families were studied long after the major mental disorder such as schizophrenia had affected the family system. A group of schizophrenia and family researchers met for the first time at the 1957 National Convention of the American Ortho-Psychiatric Association. The clinical investigations initiated a decade earlier laid the groundwork for the emerging field of family therapy. The cross-fertilization of ideas culminated in intensive family therapy, reported by 15 authorities on their research with schizophrenics and their families. So as we're talking about the history of family therapy, we have to recognize that it was initially brought to the forefront by families dealing with a schizophrenic family member. And as such, we did see they blame the mom, they blame the dad, but eventually what they came to the conclusion is that the family is all affected by schizophrenia, so the family all needs to be in therapy together. So moving on to our second issue that led to family therapy is marriage and pre-marriage counseling. The fields which are precursors of family therapy, are based on the concept that psychological disturbances arise as much from conflicts between persons as from conflict within a person. Clergy were especially prominent in offering formal premarital counseling, often as a part of an optional or mandatory preparation program before a wedding. So, for example, Catholics will do pre-Cana, which they go and learn from a priest how to be in a relationship, which is an irony that I will skip for now. Informal marriage counseling has existed for as long as marriage has been around. Just ask anybody's best friend. Formal counseling by a professional marriage counselor began probably around 70 years ago. So, what exactly was marital therapy at that time? It was not a deeply probing, intensive, or prolonged psychotherapy. Marital therapy tended to be a short-term attempt at repairing a damaged relationship. Unlike psychotherapy, which presumably probed the inner meaning, marriage counseling addressed reality issues and offered guidance to troubled couples in order to facilitate their conscious decision-making process. Early premarital counseling was contempt to help the pair prepare for marriage by becoming aware of any festering or lingering individual problems that might cause later hardships. And there's a little comic that reflects the old school marriage counseling of he's so self-absorbed and of course he's a sponge. Most people who seek help for their marriage are attempting to cope with a crisis such as infidelity, threat of divorce, disagreements regarding child rearing, money problems, sexual incompatibility, ineffective communication patterns, conflicts over power and control. And these issues cause an imbalance in the family equilibrium. At least one of the partners is usually invested in staying married, or they would not seek professional help. But the strength of the determination to stay together may vary greatly between them. A marital counselor began to focus on the couple's troubled relationship conjoint therapy, in which a couple works with the same therapist together in the same room and at the same time, which replaced earlier efforts to counsel each partner separately. And this is when the stage was being set for the development of family therapy. So in the old days, husband and wife would go to the therapist, the wife would meet with the therapist, then the husband would meet with the therapist. Conjoint therapy brought the husband and wife into the same room with the therapist so they could have an open and honest discussion about people's feelings and the things that were getting in the way of maintaining equilibrium in the family home. Moving on to the third element that led to family counseling, which was the child guidance movement. Two additional streams of thought and clinical development deserve mention for their influences in the evolution of family therapy. The child guidance movement emerged in the early 20th century and was based on the assumption that if emotional problems begin in childhood, as Freud and others were arguing, that early identification and treatment of children can prevent later psychopathology. Alfred Adler, an early associate of Freud's, and he was the one who talked about compensation and overcompensation, was especially cognizant of the key role early in family experiences played in determining later adult behavior. And Adler helped found the child guidance movement in Vienna in the early 1900s. Although child guidance clinics remained few in number until after World War II, they exist in almost every city in the United States. Today's child guidance clinics provide a setting for identifying and treating childhood psychological disorders and are valuable in involving parents and attending to the larger social systems from which the presenting problem evolved. Early treatment programs were team efforts organized around a psychiatrist, a psychologist, and a social worker, and each of them had their own specific issues that they were working with. This collaborative approach has now evolved into conjoint therapy sessions in most clinics involving both parents as well as siblings of the identified patient. Rather than viewing the child as the identified patient with intrapsychic problems or the parents as the source of the child's difficulties, today's outlook focuses on pathology among all of the family participants. Child guidance clinics continue to function on the principle of early intervention in a child's family's emotional problems in order to avert the later development of a more serious disability. So, moving on to our fourth aspect that led to the development of family therapy is group dynamics and group therapy. Group dynamics and the behavior of small groups served as models of family functioning for some early family therapists, such as John Bell. For these therapists, family therapy was a subset of group therapy, except that the participants were not strangers, and Bell called his approach the family group therapy. And there's some pictures of Mr. Bell on the bottom of the screen. Moving on to Marino, the earliest use of the group process in psychotherapy can be credited to the Austrian psychiatrist Jacob Marino, who around 1910 combined dramatic and therapeutic techniques to create psychodrama. Marino, whose psychodramatic techniques are still used today, recreated in the therapeutic process the various interpersonal situations that may have led to the patient's psychological difficulties. Marino, in the role of therapist/director, used a stage on which the patient could act out his or her significant life events in front of an audience. At certain junctures, the director might instruct the patient to reverse roles with one of the players so the patient could gain a greater awareness of how the other person saw him or her. The exploration of a family's interpersonal give and take and the resolution of its conflicts through psychodrama made this model a natural fit for many family therapists. So basically what they're doing is they're acting out the experience they believe impacted them, and the psychiatrist would sit off to the side and basically serve as the director. And these two pictures on this slide are from Marino's psychodrama experiments. Then in the 1960s, inspired by the emergence of various personal growth centers around the United States, particularly the Esalen Institute in Big Sur, California, the Encounter Group, which was part of the Human Potential movement, made a dramatic impact on the therapy scene and attracted large numbers of people, mostly from the upper middle class. Today, that enthusiasm has waned, although traditional group therapies, and to a lesser extent encounter groups, continue to exist side by side. Fundamental to the practice of group therapy is the principle that a small group can act as a carrier of change and strongly influence those who choose to be considered its members. So these encounter groups in the 1960s, people would get together and talk about why they feel unfulfilled, why they feel that their expectations are not being met. And these encounter groups, where people would share their experiences, basically provided a peer association where people could offer each other advice and critiques. So, from family research to family treatment, which began in the 1950s, and the family therapy movement was founded in the 1950s, and it pertained more to a clinical research than clinical practice. Family therapy therefore owes its legitimacy to the following facts. A. It was carried out for scientifically defensible research purposes. And B. The research was being done on clinical problems such as schizophrenia that did not respond well to the established psychotherapies at that time. And C. All early schizophrenia initiatives were initially research motivated and research oriented. So when we think about family therapy, what we have to remember is that as therapists, we always want to pursue evidence-based approaches, things that have proven over and over again to be effective. Wynn's own work at the National Institute of Mental Health with schizophrenics was based on the use of therapy as a sort of experimental data. The apparent success of the family research helped give the stamp of approval to the development of therapeutic techniques. So research that has results, and then from those results, the development of the therapeutic techniques. So, who is credited with inventing family therapy? No single person deserves the credit for first adopting a family approach with client families, although Nathan Ackerman, a child psychoanalyst in the child guidance movement, is generally credited with having written the first paper dealing specifically with treating an entire family in the mid-1950s. Bell's description of his work was not widely disseminated until a decade later. That groundbreaking monograph, along with Ackerman's text, is often thought to represent the founding of family therapy as practiced today. So Ackerman and Bell are the two so-called founding fathers of family therapy, and the picture here is of Mr. Ackerman. By the late 1950s, the family movement had surfaced nationally as family researchers and clinicians began to learn of each other's work. And Ackerman moved to New York and in 1957 established the Family Mental Health Clinic of Jewish Family Services. Then the West Coast got into the deal. By 1959, Don Jackson, remaining a consultant on the Bateson Project, had founded the Mental Research Institute, or MRI, in Palo Alto, California. Representing the East and West Coast, both institutes played emergent roles in the evolution of family therapy. So, moving on to family therapy in the 60s. Several significant developments in the 60s indicated that the field of family therapy was gaining momentum. A meeting in 1964 dealt with the application of a systems theory to understanding dysfunctional families. Now we're looking to organize, we're looking to create a systematic approach. In 1967, a conference organized by psychologist James Framo was held to stimulate and maintain an ongoing dialogue among family researchers, theorists, and family therapists. And this is a quote that attributed to James Framo. People do not marry people, not real ones anyway. They marry what they think the person is. They marry illusions and images. The exciting adventure of marriage is finding out who the partner really is. So, with this perspective, you have to look at it from the idea that when we're dating and engaged, we are always in our best behavior in a way. And then only after marriage, and especially after children are born, do our real personalities come out. Family therapy, gaining professional respectability, became a recognized topic at most psychiatric and psychological meetings. In nearly all cases, this rush to practice came before the development of procedures adequately grounded in research are based on sound conceptual formulations. In their clinical zeal, Bowman refers to it as therapeutic evangelism, many therapists attempted solutions to family dilemmas using concepts borrowed from individual psychotherapy. One notable exception to the emphasis on practice over theory and research during this period was Minuchin's Wilwick School Project, a pioneering study of urban slum families. So what we're really saying here is at this time we're not looking at therapeutic interventions that have been researched in terms of dealing with families. We're applying those therapeutic interventions that have worked on individuals. And of course we understand today that the work we do with individuals is much different than the work we do with groups. So Mnuchin's Wilwick School Project was a landmark study of poor, unstable families, largely without fathers or dependable father figures. Mnuchin developed an approach he called structural family therapy that was practical and oriented toward problem resolution, always mindful of the social context in which the family problems emerged and were maintained. By 1965, Mnuchin was director of the Philadelphia Child Guidance Clinic, originally in the heart of the African American ghetto, where he focused on intervention techniques with low-income families. The Philadelphia Center eventually transformed from a traditional child guidance clinic into a large family-oriented treatment and training center. By the late 1960s, the Philadelphia group was working with psychosomatic families, with particular attention to families of anorexia nervosa patients, applying Mnuchin's earlier concepts of boundaries and the interplay of a family subsystem to psychosomatic problems. Family therapy is very popular amongst people who have a eating disorder in the family, especially anorexia nervosa. If we go back to a few slides where we talk about the double bind, where they're getting mixed messages, a lot of times what we see is the child gets these mixed messages from their parents and they rebel. Well, anorexia nervosa oftentimes is a way of the child bringing the parents together to work together for this situation that's going on. So, behavioral family therapy first appeared in the late 1960s. Interventions with families were likely to result from empirical studies, and therapeutic procedures were continuously assessed for effectiveness. And that's really the key, is that feedback of, is this effective? Consequently, the behavioral approach with families depended less on charismatic leaders or innovative therapists and more on a clinician-researcher collaboration. Through the 1970s, behavioral therapists increasingly focused on issues related to family matters, such as teaching parents behavioral management skills to enable effective child rearing and proposing therapeutic strategies for working with marital discord and family dysfunction. So for the most part, techniques continue to outdistance theory and research in family therapy well into the 1970s. The early part of the decade saw much enthusiasm and a proliferation of family therapy approaches in various parts of the United States. With family therapy now a part of the therapeutic process, students and professionals alike were now seeking training, and the field of family therapy engaged in its first efforts at self-examination. So to kind of put this in context, the 1970s saw young psychotherapists and people in school for psychotherapy seeking out this training because they saw how it could beneficially impact a family. And of course, there's our famous family from the 70s, the Brady Bunch. In the 1970s, in another effort to bring order and self-awareness to the developing field, Beals and Ferber observed leading therapists conducting family sessions and studied videotapes and the films of their work with families. Further self-examination focused on outcome effectiveness research. Wells and Dezen found, after surveying the outcome literature, that most family therapy theorists have never submitted their methods to empirical testing, and indeed some oblivious to such a need. So, as they were assessing whether or not their techniques were effective, they realized that a lot of these techniques had never actually been tested in a scientific method. So by the end of the decade, there had been some improvement, but the effectiveness of family therapy still required continuous systematic evaluation. Since the mid-1970s, a growing number of family therapists, beginning with Herr Mustin, have argued that family therapy, both as a conceptualized and practiced, showed bias in favor of values typically considered masculine, such as autonomy, independence, and control, while devaluing those nurturant and relationship values more customarily associated with females. And again, what you have to remember is that the vast majority of clinicians and researchers up to the 1970s and into the early 80s were in fact men. By being insensitive to such issues as gender roles and wife beating, there were in many cases inadvertently reinforcing patriarchal attitudes as well as masculine and feminine stereotypes. The family therapy pioneers, all of whom were men with the exception of Virginia Satir, were brought to task for failing to pay sufficient attention to the social and political context in which the family members live, particularly in failing to acknowledge the crucial role of power differentiation between men and women, adults and children, in any ongoing relationship. And again, this power differentiation is a very important aspect of any group therapeutic environment. The feminist critique shook most family therapists out of their growing complacency by insisting that they examine their built-in gender biases regarding fixed male and female roles within a family and society at large. In future years, these family therapists would have to deal with developing greater diversity awareness and multiculturalism. Family therapists were being directed to examine their own values, attitudes, and beliefs, and to confront sexist views that could prove detrimental to helping all family members, male as well as female, feel empowered. So, on the right-hand side here, you have a man at a desk, and he appears to be interviewing or discussing something with a woman. And in his mind, she should be home looking after her baby, and in her mind, she is a fully functioning member of the work society. In the 1980s, we saw a new perspective on professionalism, multiculturalism, and a new epistemology. In the 1980s, a number of signs documented the phenomenal growth of the family therapy field. In what many consider the golden age of family therapy, more than 300 freestanding family therapy institutes existed in the United States alone, and there are fewer centers devoted exclusively to family therapy today. Family therapy became an international phenomenon in the 1980s with active training programs and congresses in Canada, England, Israel, Holland, Italy, Australia, Germany, and elsewhere. Many family therapists broadened the scope of their theories and practices during the 1980s to include collaboration with related disciplines such as medicine. Medical family therapy emerged as a subspecialty, and the journal Family Systems Medicine, now renamed Families, Systems, and Health, was founded. Doherty and Baird, the former a psychologist and the latter a physician, published a landmark book called Family Therapy and Family Medicine, in which they argued for the application of a systems approach to treating illness in which both disciplines cooperatively act as providers for patients with a variety of medical conditions. As these researchers observed, families typically are deeply troubled and burdened by the presence of a member with a serious physical illness. So, for example, if you have a child with cystic fibrosis or they have Down syndrome, this is going to affect every member of the family, and there are issues that have to be managed because this is not a psychological issue that can be remediated. These are physical illnesses that are chronic and ongoing. In addition, psychoeducational programs for families of schizophrenics were introduced in the 1980s, taking the position that they were dealing with a biological disorder, that families should not be blamed, and the entire family would profit from help in learning to cope with the disease. The feminist challenge continued to influence both theory and practice into the 1980s, joined by the recognition that we live in a pluralistic society and no one-size-fits-all solution is appropriate to all client families. Falakov led the way in presenting a cultural perspective to family therapy practice. At the same time, the need for a quicker return to functioning and the restrictions on practice imposed by managed care led to a search for brief techniques. Within the decade, managed care developed by insurance companies to hold down healthcare costs greatly influenced the practice of family therapy by delineating eligibility for services, number and frequency of sessions, fees, and length of treatment. So the psychologist doesn't determine when a patient is cured. The insurance company sets very strict boundaries as to how many times a patient can see a psychologist. And this little cartoon on the right-hand side kind of demonstrates the issue that is going on with managed care. In other countries that have socialized medicine, doctors don't make quite as much money. Insurance companies are not involved, but everybody has health insurance that is paid for through a deduction from their paycheck. A clear trend emerged toward integration of family therapy models, i.e. psychodynamic, cognitive behavioral, family systems, into a comprehensive approach in the late 90s. Most therapists were being exposed to an overview of the entire field, developing skills as what these authors called relational therapists. More than combining models, integrative efforts aim for a more holistic or comprehensive way of assessing and intervening with families. By the mid-1990s, constructionists had forced family therapists to re-examine not only some cherished systematic theoretical assumptions, but also how to most effectively intervene with troubled families. Therapeutically, it meant shifting to a greater collaboration between therapist and family members, all of whom had something to contribute about the current difficulties. Assessing a family now called for taking socioeconomic class, ethnicity, and gender roles into account. So somebody who is a single mother who works at McDonald's and has 3 kids and doesn't have a lot of money is going to have different interventional needs than an upper middle class family where mom and dad are both present and mom stays home and watches the kids. In this approach, which stresses a non-pathological orientation to the therapeutic process, all therapists can do is help family members understand and reassess the assumptions and meanings each participant has constructed about a common family problem. The therapist does not try to change the family structure, nor is he or she able to change the social conditions that help determine family functioning. Rather, change occurs as a result of a family re-examining its belief system. The entire groundwork in which it is built on. Family therapy from this new perspective becomes a collaborative creation of a context in which family members share their constructions of a reality with one another in the hope that the new information obtained will facilitate changes in perceptions among the members. In addition to gender and culture, family therapists are paying closer attention to spiritual and religious resources in the lives of their clients. In family assessment, as well as therapeutic interventions, spiritual values, related or not to formal religious institutions, may be central in the lives of many families and may act as a major determinant of family attitude and belief. So what the constructionists are saying is, and they're taking that postmodern approach where there is no one objective reality. Everybody has their own subjective reality. Is by sharing these subjective realities, you can find a more objective perspective on what's actually going on with the family. Each of us is a multicultural person who identifies with multiple groups with specific values and a particular set of experiences. Multiculturalism urges therapists to deal with both their clients and their own ecological niche, identifying individuals and families in terms of race, class, religion, sexual orientation, occupation, migration experiences, nationality, and ethnicity. Family therapy is broadening the meaning of context, moving beyond examining relationships within a family to add an ecosystemic view concerned with social systems in which families function in order to more fully understand the current diversity of family experiences. Additional challenge calls for better informing clinical practice with relevant research, evidence-based practice. Toward this end, researchers have begun to develop empirically supported psychological interventions, when feasible, in an effort to advance the scientific basis for clinical assessments and treatment. The overall goal here is to improve the quality and cost-effectiveness of such interventions and to enhance accountability by practitioners. Finally, the core competency movement emerged in renewed form in the 2000s as a way to define the knowledge, skills, and attitudes needed for responsible practice in healthcare disciplines. There are many reasons for establishing core competencies, but most center on ensuring the quality and focus of education and training programs, demonstrating competence for ethical provision of specific therapeutic services, and qualification for reimbursement by insurance companies and government agencies or programs. The achievement of competence in family therapy is developmental, accomplished through a process of growth over time. It begins with education and continues in applied training venues under supervision through these steps. Number 1, learn the core information of the field. Number 2, experience the ongoing evaluation of their absorption of the material with testing aimed at assessing overall retention of information. Apply academic knowledge to the professional field. In family therapy, this means the application of coursework to clinical practice. Undergo a period of mentorship and supervision that provides a source of direct observation, evaluation, and feedback. And finally, experience a capstone event that demonstrates overall professional ability. While the successful completion of these steps is no guarantee of any individual's ability to practice successfully, they go a long way toward ensuring that most practitioners do indeed achieve this goal. So, that's it for today's presentation. If you have any questions, please email or text your instructor. If not, go to our college. Please feel free to leave a comment, and I will get back to you as soon as possible. Thank you, and have a fantastic day.